It is a joy and privilege for me to be part of this celebration of the life and works of Dante Alighieri and the commemoration of his death 700 years ago. I was born in England and migrated with my family to Brisbane in 1956 when I was 16 years old. I befriended Italian migrants and with their help taught myself Italian. I would like to record my deep gratitude to the Italian consulate when Dr. Alighieri was consul and the Brisbane Dante Alighieri Society when Dr. Castellano was president, because I was awarded a Borsa di Studio, a scholarship enabling me to live in Rome for 3 months in 1965 to attend the Dante Alighieri School, where I went to my first formal class on the Commedia. In 1975, I enrolled in Italian at London University, where I did my honours dissertation on Dante's politics, and went on to Cambridge to work on political expectations in Dante's time, fueled by fake biblical prophecy. I always felt I owed the Brisbane Dante Alighieri Society, so for 16 or 17 years I volunteered to facilitate a reading group on the Divina Commedia in Italian with a mixed group of Australians, native speakers of English, Italian, and occasionally other languages. There was a core group in for the long haul, and some who came for a year or so and went. I was very happy that there were often 1 or 2 people who'd started Italian from scratch at the Brisbane Dante and had learnt it well enough to tackle reading the poem, text, notes, exposition, and discussion, all rigorously in Italian, as required by Dr. Carlo Gincone. At the Brisbane U3A, that's a university of the third age, an organisation founded in Toulouse, France in 1973, and in Italy they call it U3A. And there were until COVID struck, several Italian courses at different levels. And when I retired from lecturing in Italian studies at Griffith University, I volunteered a course on the Divine Comedy, but in English to make it available to more people. From a massive number of translations, I chose the Penguin Classics translation by the American academic Mark Musa, because the language he uses is clear and straightforward like Dante's. He does it in blank verse. It's not just a prose translation, but it's very readable, I think, anyway. During this time, the translation by the late Clive James, himself a poet, was published, and several U3A students bought and liked it. They found it was sometimes difficult without the footnotes, but as one person wrote, he has some excellent passages. Another Australian translation of Dante is Dr. Prue Shaw. Now, Prue Shaw, of course, was Clive James's wife. They met at Sydney University, whose acclaimed translation notes of Dante's Latin political treatise, Monarchy, was published in 1996. The first Australian to translate the whole Divine Comedy was Sir Samuel Griffith, after whom Griffith University in Brisbane is named. Not because he translated Dante, but because he was the Premier of Queensland from 1890 to 1893 and Chief Justice of Queensland from 1893 to 1903. He was involved in the movement for federation and was asked to draw up the Constitution of Australia. For respite from a very busy life, he worked on his great translation. He'd attended high school in Sydney, where he'd studied Latin and the classics, and was a graduate of Sydney University. But he was born in Merthyr, Wales, at a time when Australian citizenship was not separate from British. And he is known to have claimed, "In spirit, I am as much an Australian as any man." He considered Brisbane his home, and the current Dante Alighieri Society in New Farm, where we are at the moment, is just round the corner from Merthyr Road. He died at Merthyr House, located where Llewellyn Street is now, in New Farm, in 1920. So whom should we consider the first Australian translator of the Divine Comedy? Perhaps we could adopt the convention of the Sydney to Hobart yacht race and have two winners, and award line honours to Sir Samuel because he got there first, and race honours to Clive because he was born here. The proposal by the Dante Alighieri Society of Canberra states that the aim of the conference will be to explore the meaning of Dante Alighieri's life and work from diverse Australian perspectives. So I offered to present the response of older Australians of different backgrounds to the Divine Comedy. For my intervento, I sent students in my current, though COVID-suspended, U3A classes a set of very simple questions to answer briefly or expand upon as they wished. And just under half replied, which was quite good considering they weren't coming to class, so I couldn't nag them. The first question I asked for my survey was why people had been attracted to the study of the Divine Comedy in the first place. There was something of a consensus on this. Several participants said because they'd heard of it as being one of the great books of European civilization, a book that every educated person should have read, like War and Peace, written by a genius who had the same status in Italy as Shakespeare had in English-speaking countries. One person said the literature she had studied at school for senior was all British and Australian, and all she knew about Dante was that he'd written a description of hell, which is why a huge fire out of control is sometimes called an inferno. Another said that in the school library he'd come across an old book of the Divine Comedy and was intrigued by the illustrations by Gustave Doré. He didn't read the poem, but remembers reading Milton's Paradise Lost, and later in life bought a copy of the Hugh Carey translation of the Inferno, complete with illustrations by Doré. One woman said that 50 years ago she began collecting books as she wanted to increase her knowledge and appreciation of great literature. She had several editions of Dante and liked to pick up any one of the translations, turn to any canto and revel in the lilt of the poetry. Other times she liked to choose a passage that reflected her mood of the moment. Several of the men in the group said that although they'd not read Dante at school, their studies in a Roman Catholic boys' school had taught them to read Latin and study Christian philosophy with its Greek roots and medieval development, and to engage in discussions around such topics as free will and moral responsibility. One said this helped him to understand the Cristianissimo Dante's respect for the great Muslim Aristotelian commentators and scholars that he describes in Canto 4 of the Inferno. His schooling was a valuable preparation for reading Dante and great Western literature in general. We are talking about boys' schools in the 1950s and 1960s. Some of the women had been to Catholic girls' schools of the same era, but had not studied classical literature or Latin except for the Latin of the liturgy of the Mass. One woman wrote about how oppressive she found the atmosphere at school, very pre-Vatican II, with lots of catechism and talks of mortal sins. Whereas another woman had attended a Dominican boarding school at roughly the same time. Dominicans are known as intellectuals and educators, and she remembered a supportive atmosphere and optional classes in contemporary theology. After high school, she went to ANU in Canberra, where, as part of her degree, she could choose to attend lectures in church history for a year, given by an ex-priest who included a section on Dante. One participant wrote that he had studied medicine, and after retiring from a very demanding working life, he decided to challenge his brain and widen his experience by studying literature, and decided to join contemporary and medieval literature classes at U3A. To prepare for the purgatory classes, he read the Epic of Gilgamesh, Homer, Virgil, and Ovid, which, yes, jolly good, which would have given him a taste of the rich mythological background of the comedy. He also read stories by Boccaccio, who was 18 years old when Dante died, for his portrayals of everyday life in the Middle Ages. One participant said that the comedy was appealing as an eyewitness account of the Middle Ages and considered it was rare to find a work which combined history, personal gossip, philosophy, and romance on such a broad canvas. One reader, coming from both Roman Catholic and Anglican family tradition with a classical background from his school days and a love of mythology, said that he'd heard of Dante being one of the major founding texts of European literature and found his first experience challenging. As he read more, he was fascinated by the way Dante builds multi-layered stories from the Old Testament, New Testament, and classical sources. People sometimes think of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages and relentlessly Christian until the classical heritage was rediscovered in the Renaissance. And this reader acknowledged that he was surprised that Dante's familiar with pre-Christian classics and the depth of his understanding of mythological themes. Remembering my own initial negative reaction to the Inferno, I asked U3A students for their first impressions. One person said that he first came across the idea in a medieval mosaic, dated between 1265 and 1270, in the baptistry of St. John in Florence, which I'm sure some people here have seen. That's the one with Satan chewing sinners in his three mouths, and similar to Dante's portrayal in the last canto of the Inferno. Dante was baptized there and calls it Il mio bel San Giovanni. The family of the person responding was not religious, and he had no background beliefs and found the scenes of torture barbaric, but he was part of a group with a friend for whom they were embedded as part of their upbringing. When he met them again in the Inferno, he just saw them as fantasy and was unconcerned. One practicing Anglican said she had to admit that she rather enjoyed the blood and gore of Inferno without thinking about it too deeply. The hopelessness of eternal punishment is more than nightmarish, but it didn't fit in with the God of her imagination and beliefs. This was similar to a response by a practicing Catholic who said that such images were exploited by the church in the past to frighten people, but she didn't believe them. Another person said she just presumed that the idea of different punishments for different sins came ultimately from the Bible, which she'd only heard read out in church and had never read herself. So that when she decided to read Virgil's Aeneid, with the description in Book 6 of the descent of Aeneas into the underworld, where he observes such torments, she realized why Dante had chosen Virgil as his guide to the underworld, and also where he found his inspiration for scenes in the Inferno. She found it liberating to recognize that the earliest source of such ideas was not Christian but ancient Greek and Roman. One student said he'd recognized the Old Testament and Aristotelian idea of the contrapasso, an eye for an eye, making the punishment fit the crime, and felt that Dante uses it poetically to reflect his rage at the terrible wrongs done to himself and others, his own undeserved exile, and the atmosphere in Florence engendered by vendettas, blood feuds, and corrupt government. Another question was about what people thought of Dante's love for Beatrice, as portrayed in the comedy, and the Vita Nuova, for those who read it. We spent, I think, a couple of terms reading the Vita Nuova, but not everybody was in that group. That's the new life, Dante's book of love poems and poetry about and prose about Beatrice. 4 people answered. One person praised the beautiful poetry about Beatrice, which can be understood at different levels, literal and esoteric. Beatrice has a deeper meaning, being the personification of virtuous love. Another started by saying that he found Dante's love for Beatrice a bit weird. It was not love with a desire for emotional and physical intimacy, but rather made Dante stand back from her as from a living saint. She reminded him of both the Virgin Mary and other virgin saints in medieval hagiography, and of the ladies praised in the poetry of the troubadours, an image of female perfection which only existed in the poet's mind. Another person said he found Dante's raving about Beatrice exaggerated. In the Vita Nuova, he said, Dante portrays himself as a wimp, putting up with her, humiliating him in public by snubbing him in the street and mocking him in the party. Now, you could say, well, this is something Dante was making up in writing in the Vita Nuova, but this would have happened in actual fact. He was trying to sort of explain it away, because Dante was circulating his handwritten poetry around a small select circle of his friends and fellow poets who would have been familiar with the local gossip. In the comedy, however, this person says he thinks of Beatrice as a personification of Dante's Christian spirituality. One reader wrote, I really disliked Beatrice. She was pretty mean to Dante, both in real life, for example, in Vita Nuova, and in Dante's imaginary afterlife, but continued that she is his muse, and therefore outside normal social and emotional connections. As an allegory, she is central to the comedy, and her disdain for him is tempered by the need for him to understand his faults and work towards becoming his best. One person echoed this when she said she thought that the comedy is essentially a poem about morality, and admired Virgil for his steady guiding intelligence, which reminded her of a good father and son relationship. Several people wrote about Virgil. One said that Dante's admiration for Virgil was so great that he chose a pagan and not a Christian as his guides to the moral realms of hell and purgatory. And it is not Virgil's fault if he's not baptized, and so must give way to Beatrice as his spiritual guide to heaven. Commenting on this, another said that Virgil struck him as a figure of Moses, who led the Israelites through the wilderness, but was not spiritually worthy to enter the promised land himself. Also, teachers who sometimes have to recognize that a certain pupil is more intelligent and gifted than they are, and will one day surpass and lead them. On the same tack, one participant said that Virgil in his poem had kept Aeneas following the right path until he completed his prophesied journey from Troy to Latium, which would eventually result in the founding of the huge great Roman Empire. Some scholars believe that an important message of the comedy was political, that the Pope and Holy Roman Emperor should both return to Rome and work together to heal the terrible rifts in Christendom, and Christian families, cities, and nations were going into battle against each other over earthly territory and wealth. And Shakespeare must have got somewhere a story from the Italian chronicles about the fighting between Guelphs and Ghibellines, in the same family, in families in the same city, when he turned the Montachi and Capuletti into the Montagues and Capulets and wrote Romeo and Juliet. The same person said that his favourite passage in Purgatory was that the figure of Cato the Younger, the pagan guardian of the Christian mountain of Purgatory, he noted that Virgil had described him among the righteous in the Roman realm of the dead, and as a law giver. This is in the Aeneid, Book 8. And he says that Dante would also have known Lucan's description of the nobility of Cato and his willingness to die for freedom. in the Pharsalia, Book 9. And Dante says he's read both Aeneid and the Pharsalia. In fact, somewhere he says that he learned the Aeneid off by heart. Yeah. Well, some people learned the whole Divine Comedy off by heart. Now we can't learn anything off by heart. Which brings us to the three final points of a general nature. One person, a regular churchgoer, said that Purgatorio was her favourite candidate, as it gives hope to every man who can gain the goal of heaven if they work to put right the wrongs they've committed in this life. The idea of working upwards, paying off one's sins, is appealing as long as the ultimate reward of life is there. Another woman who is not a church giver and has no beliefs about heaven, nevertheless found it interesting to explore Dante's poetic portrayal. She almost enjoyed the occasional discussion in class about life after death, because different views were aired without an insistence on one set idea. And she said often people are unable to think or talk about death, and she has friends who are unhappy to have the subject even mentioned. And of course, we're talking about older people here in the U3A. Another participant ended her contribution with the quoted observation that while we no longer have to fear banishment from our cities if we take opposing political positions, in other ways, our world is still living into the fear of and the results of war, corruption, inequality, greed, treachery, murder, and other sins as at the time of Dante. Even today, the Vatican is still investigating charges of corruption. The Divine Comedy is still as relevant to us today, just the names of people and places have been changed, and that was a quotation. In conclusion, I found that even Australians with no previous knowledge of Italian language or literature responded positively to Dante. So many wanted to enroll that we had a waiting list until we were given 2 classrooms. Considerable enthusiasm and no dropouts as far as I remember. At a time when in Australian universities, the humanities and in classical and European languages are losing their importance, even considered elitist and a waste of time compared with the sciences, I was impressed how delighted some new readers of Dante were to reconnect with the grounding in the Judeo-Christian tradition and Greco-Roman mythology of their youth, which helped them to understand the background symbolism of the poem. Some readers without this background enjoyed adding classical literature to their knowledge bank and losing some preconceptions about the Middle Ages. At least one person started, and in this continuing through Zoom, a course on Italian language and on Latin language and Roman history at U3A. They teach Latin at U3A, both their courses both in classical Latin and medieval Latin. All peoples with their diverse languages and cultures have their own foundation myths and histories which link them with their past and give them a sense of who they are. As our official national language, English, is a European language, all English-speaking Australians may claim European languages and cultures as part of their heritage, including Celtic languages such as Welsh and Irish. We're not leaving out I'm not speaking just of English nationality, the people of English origin, but also Irish and Scots and with their own mythological cycles. And of course, I'm not excluding people of non-European background who want to keep their own cultural background as well as their Australian identity, or Australians like Chris Mooney's seems to have been speaking to us, who study and eventually embrace non-European languages and cultures. I'm just saying that it's good to know something about the past, what we've got at our shoulders. And I see the effort that Australians of Indigenous descent are making to reclaim their own traditions and stories, like our other speaker. But at this point in time, perhaps Indigenous Australians are not the only Australians who should be concerned about saving their dreaming. Thank you.